Tonshi, my name is Josh Carrier McKenna, and I live on the ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in so-called Vancouver, BC. I'm Métis. My family's roots run deep in Treaty 1 territory of the Red River Valley in Manitoba. My family names include Carrier, Hamlin, Vandal, Parenteau, Landry, Lawrence, McGilvery, and the unnamed Cree women that populate my family tree. Today our guest is Elder Tom McCallum. Elder Tom McCallum, White Standing Buffalo, is a Sundance lodge keeper, elder, and advocate of the Michif language and healer. Elder Tom?
Nanaskomten. Tansen tutimak. Min japiagota japianu. Atsumustatnak. Tan tiuhtsiania. Tan siis ipitaguhti anuti kihtsikemah. Nemiuhtiinuute japianan nuskagisagak. Kihtsikisagauhan nusuuta imigujakman tuumina piagoomse teisep muhtiak. Saaketta vahkuhtsenia. Kiwit nohkuuti. Ega ntuutimak. Nemussumak. Nappu nemussumak. Manitoba uhtse. Egi uhtuhti itse kuista oolta. Egi piiksku itsegen mahmistugu simun. Michif kaisi katahkoon piikskuun. Egu siis uja oo. Amaga nie danuutika kenistaugi ahkuta nootspugun. Iwi ja ni hiu jahkuma. Maga ke apetsuk tasti on he. Atse muun anhe kagi pia saanskuna maaguusiah. Jagune. Tihtmistä kuusimuin, tihti hiuiwin. Pihtau kussaan pikskuun jagon, kagi pimikuujah. Nanaskumun. Ega muuti Michif kaisi katahko muuta pikskuun. Ui passakuunahko minä piekoul, ei siinok. Uskaa jakugu. Ik tapahtahko jagon. Tän sumagagi piitse piksku jahka jaas. Ego tän suma anuskaa kissagaguma. Jagon malle Michif jagon. Tän se kehti naatsuma teise. Ntut saha mahke jagon. Piitus nientse piksku anapses. Ego akutagagugu. Utiuhti saagasti nohka. Enes naabiga esi kasutsega tihti. Nii hiauak. Nappu jagunek piksku õnnenma. Tän se niendetuan. Ego joo tän je etuak. Piisus hitsapses maga keapets. Nse tuhtatunan. Ego ei mioassegi konma kihtihtaa kohki konma pikskuun. Ette kui mantu le bon Dieu. Kipianskuna mago jahke konma pikskuun. Utstopugu tap muhtataa jahke konma te passakuna mah. Ja kon meitä kun oma ujaa muuta mahku ma nuskaa kissaga kutta kamama opi jahku. I want to thank everyone and Josh and what he's doing, trying to revive our perspective, the Métis perspective, the language, and the things that we had done as a culture, a Métis culture, which is very great because we have to keep it going. The Creator, I believe, has given us that way of life because we are a mixed European and indigenous people from this territory, well, from this land we call Turtle Island. And there's a diverse group that we call the Métis. Depending on the geographical area where they come from, their language varies a little bit, but we still understand each other. One is not more important than the other. One of the things that's, to me, is very important is the idea of a noun-based language and a verb-based language. And a question I asked this morning to Josh is that do you think that Michif is a verb-based language? And he answered in the affirmative and went on to explain why he said that. And for me, the way I see it is the verbs in our Michif language are indigenous. Cree, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, maybe some Dene. And the nouns are in French. So that's a language that came about because of the union of two different nations, or more than two. But that's how people got along. And as they spoke it more often, the children picked it up, of course, and kept it going. Lately, English has taken over. And this is the language that most of us use now, is English. Which is kind of, we should be speaking French, because that's who our ancestors are, not English so much. Now they are, I guess. But we need to go back to our language and know who we are from that perspective. How did it come about? Why did it come about? And how does it impact the way we behave, the way we see things, and the way we interact with each other? I'll just give you a little example. When we meet each other, we say, hello, how are you? In English. In Michif, my Michif, from where I come from, we say tanse. And tanse does not mean hello. It actually translates to how. It's part of a phrase, and the whole phrase is tansikia kisayan. And that translates to, how are you feeling? How is your health? That's what it translates to, because health to us was the single most important thing that we have. If we don't have health, very little else matters. And the example that I use to qualify that phrase is that when you have a toothache, you're not healthy. And certainly not much matters except that toothache when it's throbbing in your head. You could have a bank full of money, but that won't matter to you because that toothache is number one. Anything that you do, you cannot do well because you have that toothache. It's bothering you. You really feel it. So that's what we come down to when we say tanse. We shorten it because we understand the rest of the phrase. So I hope that you can look at that and just look at it and see if it makes any sense to you. As opposed to hello. When you say hello, what does that really ask of you? Not much. Hello. It's just kind of like, huh, saying something like that, right? It doesn't throw any questions in your mind. Hello. How do you respond to that? You say hello back to it. So you're echoing something that somebody else said. Whereas in the Michif language, we say tanse, we understand the other part, and it opens a whole big door to the direction that you can go in with that. You can say namananto, means I'm okay. Or you can say moigo es, which means it's not right. Something's not right about me. So look at the differences between hello and tanse. What, that conversation that you're going to have from there on.
Tanse would imply that there's almost like more of a relational aspect to it right off the bat, eh?
Yeah, that's right. And you connect with that person because you're asking them a personal question about their health. It seems like the implication there would be that you're concerned about their health. You're concerned about them. Whereas hello doesn't really say anything about that, their concern or the connection that you have.
What do you think that says then about the reasons why speaking our languages was made illegal throughout the process of colonization? Like, do you think that it almost seems like our ability to relate to one another or practice more relational ways of being in community was targeted through cutting off our languages?
That's, I think to me, what I would get from that is we're free people. We were free people. We wanted to trade with whoever we wanted to, but the government put stipulations on that. We could only trade with the Hudson's Bay Company. So they had a monopoly on that trade, which impacted us in our lives, because then you would have to take your furs to maybe a great distance to go and sell, whereas if there's other traders around, you'd trade with them right there, right then and there. So that would kind of like cut our freedom off.
Mm.
Yeah, we wouldn't be free to do what we wanted to do. We had to go to a certain place and trade with a certain group of people, namely, of course, the Hudson Bay Company. And our languages tied us together, like what we just shared about Tanse, asking about that person's health. So then we become more of a cohesive unit, the Métis people. Whereas if we spoke English, then we start to understand those laws from an English perspective. And that's kind of like a control, one object to another object where there's no connection there at all. All we're doing is we're just trading, that's all. Whereas on the other side, on the Michif side, we'd probably stop and make a fire, make tea, and speak our language and get along really well. And we knew the relationships because we were small at one time, not as many as we are today. So that's a threat to the very monopoly of the Hudson Bay Company and Canada at the time. So they did not want that threat to be there. They wanted us to be subservient to their laws. And in order to do that, we'd have to speak the language of English, which is their language, our language being Michif, which is more connecting, connects to everything. Like the verbs, they say that we're connected to everything in the universe. So our language connects us immediately to that connection, which is not good for them because then we are a unit. We are a nation. We became a nation, recognized ourselves as a nation. And we did not want to be treaties. We did not want to sign treaties because those treaties restricted you to a parcel of land, which is called a reserve or a reservation. And there was an agent that worked for the government that oversaw people. It's called an Indian agent. And you had to get a signed note from him in order for you to step out of that reserve, and which is not what we wanted as Métis people. We wanted to be able to go wherever we wanted to go at any time we wanted to go. And our language was part of that because our language is who we are.
It sounds like the removal of our language, or the way that we just were kind of forced into speaking English for the most part, is almost like one of the early steps of implementing like internalized colonization, right? Where suddenly, like you were saying, like you don't really approach things relationally anymore once you're speaking English. Like you said, the trade would have been different. You might have sat and had a cup of tea with someone and chatted with them right out, like and just built up those relationships. But it seems like there's maybe a lot more to losing language than most people would think, right? Like, I think a lot of people think about, you know, speaking English versus speaking Michif, and they're just like, oh, it's just two different ways of communicating. But they don't really think about, like, these same sort of implications that you're pointing towards here.
What you say is true. When you have that language that ties you to other families, people within your community, when you hear something in Michif and you hear something in English, that's different. English is, very difficult to describe. What they came up with is it's a noun-based language. It's nouns. It's all full of nouns. So in the English way of looking at things, you're a noun. You yourself are a noun. And a noun is a name of a person, a place, or a thing. And that's how everything is approached. On the other hand, in the Michif language, with the verbs that we have in that language, which come from the indigenous side, you're connected to everything when you speak that language. English, you're not connected to anything because you're two objects, right? You're a noun. An example, the word in Michif for water is nipi. On the French side, it's l'eau. They say l'eau. For us, on this side, nipi. When you say nipi in that language, anybody that understands that language will say, yeah, water, water. But that comes from two root words, that word nipi. The first part, the N-I, ne, comes from a word niya, which means I or I am or I be. That's that first part of nipi, ne. P, the P-I, means to come or to unfold. So literally, the word for water, nipi, means I am unfolding. So that tells you a lot more than water. H2O, right? Yeah. So there's that connection right away. To water, water is life. That's what we've been told. So for us, nipi means I am unfolding. So you're part of everything that's happening in the universe. And that's the difference in the languages.
It's interesting because, I guess this really is just like, the difference between the noun and the verb. But it's interesting that one thing that I'm picking up from you talking about the difference in the languages is that in Michif, like a name for something is a descriptor of what it is, whereas in English, it's just like a word that's ascribed to just be that thing.
Yeah, an object.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Michif, yes, that's true that the word for what we're looking at or what we're talking about is actually the living being of what water is. It's a living being as opposed to an object. So when you speak that language, you're connected to that person immediately. Sometimes without us realizing it. We are that connection. Or in English, it doesn't have that.
So what do you think that the implications of teaching language and like really like pushing for that are now? Like, do you think that it's like goes beyond just culture? Because considering how practicing our culture, speaking our language has been something that ultimately Canada has previously actively tried to stop. Like, do you think it's a political act now to teach language and put out those opportunities for young Métis people now?
It certainly is. Gives you a change in perspective. When you speak the Michif language as opposed to what we're speaking right now is English. So we think in English when we speak English. You can't think anything else if you're speaking English.
Yeah.
So that's like containing somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Bring them over here,
Mm-hmm.
making them an English-thinking person.
Mm-hmm.
So that our language, if we go back to our language, then we'll start thinking in Michif,
Mm-hmm.
which is that connection to everything in the universe. It's a whole different perspective. And that's why it's so, so important for younger people to learn the
Mm-hmm.
language. And
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter Northern Michif, Southern Michif, or anything like that. It's good to promote all of them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take one and promote that's fine. As long as they learn it,
Mm-hmm.
then it will go into who you are and what you are.
Mm-hmm.
Much more than just a mental
Mm-hmm.
exercise.
I think the way that you describe all of the different like implications of learning your language and like what that means beyond just using different words to say something, like just the relationship it gives you to like others in your environment around you is something that is sort of an overarching theme that I'm trying to go for with this podcast. It's that we reconnect with our culture in a way that is all encompassing and takes all those different factors into consideration. Because the main thing that worries me, at least with how kind of like colonialism teaches us we should be engaging with our culture, is something that, and he comes up on every episode of this podcast, but Howard Adams, who we were chatting about earlier, talks about, where he says that the way that Canada teaches us to interact with our culture is one that really waters it down and doesn't really account for that different relationship with everything, that different way of doing things. So he kind of says it's like Canada will encourage you to do very basic, like shallow cultural activities in order to stop you from developing like proper actual connection with your community around you and fighting for things like land back efforts or things like that, or reparations for residential school survivors. Like they'll try to stop that sort of community organizing. But I think that perspective on culture as being like so much more than what Canadian society would recognize culture as is like a really important one to keep in mind, you know, where even language is not even just how we think about language as just like a basic communication tool in Canadian society. Like when you talk about Michif, it's so much more. Like the language is not just a way of speaking, it's a way of relating to everything around you, you know? So I think like bringing back those old ways, language and culture, and the way that we did things, and the way that we operated as a community, and the way that we looked after each other, and the way that we fought for our rights is like really what I'm going for. And I think it's a key part of our culture that is overlooked by so many Métis people as a result of colonization.
You know, it's really, we're talking about the government and the language that they have. If you don't know anything about Michif, you can't promote it.
Mm-hmm.
Because how are you going to promote it? What you're going to use is English grammatical structure is what you're going to be used to promoting it. And that's not what Michif is. Michif is much more than that. It's the voices from the universe.
Mm-hmm.
The trees have a voice. The grass has a voice. Water has a voice. The wind has a voice. We're removed from that when we come from a noun-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
We can't understand it. How can we? We've never been there. Until such time, there's a guy by the name of Bohm who used to work with Albert Einstein. He said, we need to have a language that talks about transformation, flux, and change. And he said, if we had a language like that, we'd call it a Rio mode. Well, before he died, he had an opportunity to listen to Algonquin speaking people. And he said, that's it. That's the language we need. So he understood he's a physicist, quantum physicist. He understands that to a certain degree, but he didn't know what it was. But when he heard it, he felt it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's that connection again. When you come from that vibrational frequency of the languages that are indigenous, as we call them, for us it's Michif, then you can feel it. Just as you walk in a bush, you feel a different frequency than when you walk down Hastings
Mm-hmm.
in Maine. There's a different frequency there
Mm-hmm.
altogether. And it's not connected to anything in the universe because it's created by us,
Mm-hmm.
that noun-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you go out in the bush, like what we talked about this morning, when you leave Vancouver on Friday
Mm-hmm.
and you're going home, by the time you get to Chilliwack, a lot of the traffic has dissipated. And the first thing that you do is, like that, you take all that stress out. When you talk about people who don't understand that,
Mm-hmm.
don't understand, well, what do you want to learn your language?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't English good enough?
Yeah.
That's one perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they don't have the other perspective, they don't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it important?
Mm-hmm.
It's very important because you start to understand all that is
Mm-hmm.
from a verb-based perspective.
Yeah.
Because you're part of it.
Yeah.
Just like when you go into a sweat lodge, we can stand outside and talk about, oh yeah, it's hot in there, they got hot rocks, they got water, they're singing, and it doesn't really mean nothing to you until you go inside, then you feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Because our languages are, when we say verb-based, they come from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
It's a feeling language, as opposed to English, which is a mental language.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the elders say those two have to come together, your heart and your mind. Then you have what you call whole brain thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And much of our language is that,
Mm-hmm.
whole brain thinking. And it's important.
I like that whole brain thinking, that heart and mind coming together. That does it. It makes me think of one thing. There's one bit in terms of. I think that's how we need to approach like reintegrating more of our culture, is with that whole brain thinking. You know, one thing that Howard Adams says. I'll just read you an excerpt from this. Is he one of the things that he suggests in his book, right, is that colonialism tries to force us to embrace cultural nationalism, which he says ultimately dulls our political consciousness and reduces the likelihood of like indigenous liberation movements, like actually fighting for our land back or more of our rights. And he describes cultural nationalism as like a reactionary nationalism to the presence of colonialism that perpetuates this idea of keeping Indigenous people in their place, like off to the side of Canadian society, and just, you know, go off and do your thing and don't bother us with like trying to get reconciliation, right? Mm-hmm. Is what he suggests is the risk there. And so he says that it can almost have this effect where Indigenous people will engage in extreme separatism and just remove themselves from the rest of Canadian society, just so that, like, because we're being forced out. So, and he says it brings up this risk that we just hope that colonialism will go away, and we kind of give up our fight against it and just hope that if we just don't do anything, that it'll kind of go away over time. But I was wondering if you think, like, what is a way that we can approach living in a colonized country with that full-brained thinking, like where we are practicing our culture but also asserting our presence here and like not giving up that fight against colonialism for the next 7 generations to follow.
Yeah, having that whole brain thinking, we do that when we're in our ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
We feel it, and we feel the presence of other than human
Mm-hmm.
beings in that ceremony. So when we practice our way of life. Our way of life is to integrate with all that is in the universe. There's no such thing as giving up. It's not that. It's not a race to get to a place over here. That place is inside of us. So when you are the best possible person you can possibly be, then you are doing what those questions that you asked, right? You are, as Maslow probably would say, is on our hierarchy of dependence, right? We'd be at the top there. So that's what we do. That's how we work. But we don't leave anything aside. We call in the trees. We call in the water through song. We call in the sun. We call all of that to be with us. They're already there, but we're opening up ourselves to all that is. Whereas in a noun-based world, we wouldn't be doing that. It's all about me, right? It's all, nothing else matters. But for us, it's all about community, what you call community. To come together, to assist those ones that are coming behind us to reach their full potential. And we put things in there. And land is very, very important for that, because that's where the medicines grow. That's where we go to get the berries, all of that stuff. Go there and pick all of that. And the children learn about that. And they'll ask you, can we go bear picking again? Or they have questions like that. When we were in Alacross, the church was very powerful. There was a priest who used to go to the post office when women would order from catalog, and they'd make the women open the boxes, parcels, and if they didn't like what they saw in terms of clothing, they'd have to send it back. And I didn't see this. My dad told me this. And other elders talked about it. The women used to have to bind themselves so that they wouldn't entice the men while they're in church. This is the history of my community.
That's why.
That's how powerful that priest was. And here's another example. There was a school there. It was run by the church. It was called St. Joseph's School. So they decided to build a new school with a high school in it. We didn't have high school before. It went to grade 9, that was it. And big school. And the people wanted to have autonomy from the church. They wanted to run that school. So there's a big argument between a priest and all his followers and this young man who's passed on now, more kind of radical thinker, and he had all his young people behind him. In front of their school, they were arguing. Finally, they got into a fist fight. And that guy, of course, prevailed. He was younger and stronger than the priest. And everybody said, oh, something's going to happen to him. Something's going to happen to him. Sure enough, about 2 months later, they had a party. And this guy drank a Mickey without stopping, Mickey of whiskey. And it stopped his heart and he died.
Yeah.
People said, see, God punished him.
Yeah.
God punished him because of what he did. And so the people got the school, and they had a board of directors there from the community, and renamed the school. And guess what they called it?
They name it after that guy?
Father Russaganall School.
Oh, my gosh.
And that's what it's still called today.
Yeah.
So the conditioning is still in the head, right?
Yeah.
There's not very many people that go to church anymore. There's no more priests in all across, but it's in the bars or in the head. So that's this whole idea of our language, going back to our language, and the lifestyle that we had, the connections that we had. Those were just about erased through the dogma of the church. So the people now run their own mass. So there's a lot of things that happened because of the influence of the church. It's not that it's bad. It's conditioning, right? It's run through fear, because if you don't comply with it, you're going to go to hell. Right? That's who who wants to go there?
I mean,
Nobody.
it's a pretty good threat to make, right?
Yeah. So the people are stuck there. They're still stuck there. There's a lot of younger people now that are, questioning it. They're not going to church. They're questioning it. And for myself, that was my great fear, going to hell, because I was raised Catholic. I was an altar boy, and I wanted to be a priest. But around 12 years old, I saw these workers of God was not consistent to what they were preaching. So I wanted to get away from it, and I did. I ran away, but it was still stuck in my head. Anytime there was a threat, well, God help me, right?
Yeah.
But eventually I ran into this, it was presented to me that what they call native spirituality, and started working that into myself and looking at things in the different experiences that I've had. Didn't jive with what I was told in the church. So now I know I am a free person. I can choose what I want to believe without repercussions. That this being we call God or Creator or Mantu is not how he's portrayed. He's benevolent. He's not going to condemn you to go somewhere after he made you.
Yeah.
So it's important that we learn, and that's our mother's side. Our father's side, the paternal side, is the church. That's what it was, and they took charge, and that's the change came. The women followed their husbands because we live in a paternalistic world, so to speak. And so they picked up, because a lot of what's written in the Bible is good stuff. It's really it's about being kind to each other, but it excludes anything beyond humanity. Just human beings are the only ones that have spirit, whereas the other side, our verb-based side, says no, everything has a spirit, which is energy. Everything has energy. So that's what I believe in today, and that's our mother's side. That was oppressed, it was pushed aside. So we need to learn our mother's side. When we hear Michif people say, I am the best of both worlds, well, they have missed the best of our mother's side. They have missed, which is that worldview that they had.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that, our mother's side, because that's something that you've talked to me about before. And it's interesting because, like, we are often portrayed outwardly to the rest of the world as Métis people without really a lot of connection to our First Nations side, to our First Nations cousins and ancestors. But a lot of the stuff that you've taught me is even all of the cultural and spiritual practices that we took part in that most Métis people don't know. Like, you were even telling me earlier about having to debate with a guy about whether Métis sweat or not.
Yeah.
And obviously we have, and we do. But why have we become so separated from our mother's side? Like, I know that you said there was an element of, like, kind of transitioning into a paternalistic world, but, like, how did we end up straying so far? Was it a product of colonialism? Was it our own choice to leave behind our spirituality? And, like, how did we get so far, and how do we get back to it?
I guess you'd have to go back to the first union between a French and a native woman. So the French Catholics are very paternalistic, right? You don't have any woman priests. There's no bishops that are women. And the Pope has never been a woman.
Yeah.
So that is what prevailed, because they're very dominant Like in the Bible, it says women were chattel. And the women were subservient to the husband in that culture. And they moved over here. The women went with them. They went with their husbands. They still practice certain things like the physical medicines. The physical medicines were no threat because they thought, well, just a root, what's that going to do, right? Kind of thing. And they didn't really, the church did not really press to eradicate that, the medicines itself. The ceremonies, yes, it was outlawed. The ceremonies were outlawed. So in order for us, as the emerging Métis, to follow the Roman Catholic Church, and that's what dictated of how we were going to live, and that's how it slowly got watered down. There are certain family groups that maintained that and carried it forward, and that's why it has come around full circle, coming back again. The argument I had, our exchange with this teacher that I had, was teaching us Métis studies, and he said that Métis do not sweat. I said, no, that's not true. Mm-hmm. It's not true. And we argued back and forth. I couldn't prove to him because we were in Saskatoon, right? Mm-hmm. But I saw him in my hometown about a year later after taking that instruction from him, and he was pumping gas, and I ran up to him and I said, am I ever glad to see you? And he said, I'm glad to see you too. I said, remember when we argued about, you said that Métis did not sweat? He said, I didn't say that. I said, you did. You said that. We argued about it. Yeah. And he said, no. What I said was Métis did not wear blankets. So, because I was going to take him to elders there that are there. That's who told me that they used to sweat. I didn't know that growing up because it was outlawed and the church frowned upon it, so they had to go do it in secret. All the old people, the elders and the men, went to sweat in the bush, and I never knew that until my sister told me that when we used to paddle, that's how we traveled canoeing. And they had a big 18-foot canoe to fit everybody. And he said every night when we camped, our dad would go and make a little sweat lodge. He'd bring about 2 rocks, and he'd sweat there by himself. And then this other elder, we were watching. These guys were making a sweat close to where he lived, in the bush. And I said, Tansik Tichtin Mushum, which means, what do you think, Grandpa? Mm-hmm. And he said, Mogoes, it's not right. Taneke, I said, why? Moiksis in Yanan Gitutin, and he said, we didn't do it that way. We do it different, because they come out every round day. They come out. He said, we didn't do that. There was a hole on top of the sweat lodge, a little flap on it. We'd open that flap, that'd be 1 round. We wouldn't open the door. He said, we would not come out till we finished everything. That's when it would come out. Oh. So he said, yeah, he told me all those guys that he used to sweat with, all the old people, and you'd never know because nobody talked about it. Yeah. It was outlawed, and it was frowned on by and so the people, the church, the people that work for the church said that was the work of the devil. Like that. And so that's what's in the people's heads about sweats. You work with the devil. There's one guy from, he was a Chippewa Indian from back east. He was very much into the AA movement. He was an AA person. He came to all across, the people called him there. But he was also a Franciscan monk. And he came and did a church ceremony, but he had a teepee where he kept a host. And he had water, big tubs of water in the 4 directions, and he used feathers inside. Oh, yeah. And he did things that no priest had ever done. Yeah. He said, hey, you Crees, I'm a Ojibwe. I can sing like Elvis. If you think you can sing better than me, get on up here, he said. And people were just shocked.
Yeah.
They didn't. And then he had people lining up. There was just people outside all over from different communities that come there. There was a long lineup. He had his feathers and he was doctoring people one by one.
Wow.
And one of those elders told me there was an eagle flying around inside the church. I didn't
nuts.
hear it myself,
Yeah.
but he heard it.
Wow.
And then after he finished the ceremony there, he walked through town. To the other side of town, there was a sweat lodge over there. And all these people were behind him. He was like the Pied Piper. Man, they all went over there and he conducted a sweat lodge. He had a pipe,
Wow.
There was a guy from Beauval they brought in. He couldn't walk. His legs were just bent like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they were carrying him, one on each arm. Put him in there. They dragged him inside the sweat. After the first round, he come crawling out. On his own, crawling out. He still couldn't stand. They had to help him stand up, but he crawled out.
Wow.
So that's amazing. So that kind of broke the spell
Yeah.
on the people. That if a priest does this, there must be nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
They didn't all come rushing to
Mm-hmm.
order the sweat, but it eased their minds
Mm-hmm.
about what was happening.
Well, it's even like some of our biggest like Métis icons, like even like Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, obviously both were pretty into Catholicism,
Mhm.
but Gabriel was a pipe carrier,
Yeah.
and like I was telling you earlier, there's even a sweat lodge on his property,
Mhm.
like out in Batoche,
Yeah.
and so it's like since the beginning, it's like our people have been like merging these spiritualities and have been practicing like sweat lodge and pipe ceremonies, and but it's overlooked so often. And I think like maybe part of that reason why it's overlooked reminds me of something else we were talking about earlier today, with even the way that Michif words are spelt out when it's been written out, is because in Canada, right, to be recognized as an Indigenous nation, we have to prove that we're culturally distinct. And we don't have to prove that we're culturally distinct to other Indigenous people. We need to prove it to the Canadian government for them to let us know if we are Indigenous or not. And so it kind of like politicizes us in this really weird way where we have to present our culture in a way that satisfies the Canadian government. So do you think that might also be a contribution to why we have been so separated from our mother's side? Because we're trying to cut our ties for ways that we are similar to Cree and Anishinaabe people and just like focus on almost this like sash and fiddle imagery that you see so prominently across all Métis things. Feels like our culture is almost like watered down to like just the sash and fiddle sometimes, because it's just like, that's us. See, we're different, whereas we forget about our ties to our First Nations cousins and ancestors. Like even Elder Maria Campbell, she describes the Métis as cousins of the Cree. So what do you think about that? Do you think that way that we've been politicized has like played a role in our separation from our mother's side?
Yeah, I believe that. I believe that they've done what they could, to oppress us, keep the oppression there.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly when the Métis asserted themselves and they said, we want to deal with you in a different way. We do not want to take treaties. They came up with a concept called scrip, which is what they used to do to soldiers. When they came back from the war, they give them that scrip, land scrip. So that's the way they dealt with us here. Even that was in turmoil, they changed it a few different times. And they gave 1.4 million acres to the people in Manitoba. Treaty 10 area was in Alacross. And so they had the treaty commissioners there, then they have the scrip commissioners, and they have the scrip buyers, all on the same table. And they just asked people, are you treaty or are you Métis? What do you want to do? So they give them that choice. And of course, the Métis got their scrip note or money, right? There's either money or a scrip note. And the buyers would buy that right away because they could apply it to anywhere in Canada.
So $100 or like
no, it's $240
200 yeah.
or 240 acres. It started off with 160 acres, but then it went to 240. And my grandfather took scrip for all the family. And for my mother, he got $200 scrip, $200 cash. And he gave it to the bishop, Bishop Pascal. That's what it says in there. It's got care of Bishop Pascal. So when I went to see the Pope when he came to Canada, I wanted to ask him, hey, where's my scrip? Because it's care of, right?
Yeah.
He didn't give it out right.
Well, and if he's been holding on to it that long, you can bet that there's been interest that's built up on that, right?
Yeah. But I couldn't even get close to him.
Yeah.
So that's the question about them wanting to keep us oppressed. Of course, the media, had a lot to play with that, especially the movies that we saw. They're always portrayed the Métis or the Indian as some kind of savage that was incoherent, right? Mm-hmm. They kind of like had a mumbling kind of language, kind of thing, right? And so that way, the dominant society was up here, and we're down here. Mm-hmm. And that's where we belong. We don't belong anywhere else. So how could you assert yourself when you're seen in that way, right? And the things that stood in our way was, in order to be recognized as a nation, you're going to have a land base, you're going to have a common language, and you have to be recognized as being who you are. Mm-hmm. So we didn't have that. We didn't have a land base. That 2.4 million acres was gone, right?
Yep. Individual
families still had some. Same within Isle of Cross. Individual families still had some and hung on to it. But most of the time it was, it passed into the scrip buyers, which were the railroads, the church itself, and the banks, railroad. So that's where everything went. It's just almost like when you have a blender, you put all the different fruit in it. You get that's what came out of it when a scrip and dealing with the native people in that way, to keep us subservient. Because when they first came out, I'll go back again. When they first came to this land, they planted the flag. They said, "This is for the Queen." Mm-hmm. But they found out international law says that you cannot own land or take land if people are out living there. Mm-hmm. And they found out that native people were living there. So how are we going to deal with this, right? We want that land. We want what's on that land also. So they had different things that they came up with. One of them was that, anybody that's not Christian cannot own land. And another thing they said, these people that are living here, the natives, the Indians, they had usufructory rights. Mm-hmm. And that's usufruct is an old Roman law concept, where if the generals went out and conquered the land, that land belonged to them. But when they came back to Rome, that land would come back to Rome. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of ownership we had. Yeah. So when they came here, the land went back to them. So yeah, it's the mindset, the mindset that they have, that we're not human beings like them, we're more like savages, and that's another word that they use. And if you don't improve your land, then it's not really yours, you're just holding it. Mm-hmm. So if settlers come here to improve the land, that land is theirs then. Yep.
Yeah, but their idea of improving the land is making the land more profitable, right? Whereas our idea of, taking care of our land or improving it was really just continuing on with a reciprocal relationship with it, right? Like you see nowadays that we're hurtling towards climate disaster because of the way that, colonization has taught us to treat the land and to exploit it and try to profit off it. So it's just, it's this idea that we weren't advanced enough to do to the land what they were doing. But it's like there was actually just a relationship of care where you would only take what you needed, right? And like, you know, I even hear stories about like how you would like harvest certain areas and then, you know, let the plants grow back, or you would only take enough of a plant where you're not going to kill it, but you're going to take what you need and leave the rest to keep flourishing, right? Whereas that's not the colonial approach to improving land, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that whole idea of we weren't improving the land is really just like it's a very silly idea, right? Because like the land was much healthier prior to colonization than it is now.
It is.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, what you say is true. That's because that's part of their lifestyle and the way that they have their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going around different parts of the world, you know, imperialism, right? Trying to get as much gold as they could, which is what they were after when Columbus, Cabot, and all those Cartier, you know, they're coming around. They're looking for something. What is that something? It's that something that will make them that superpower that they all want to be. And this land, with its untold riches in their eyes, you know, which was gold, and of course, in Virginia, it was tobacco. Tobacco was a really big, and it is still today. But all those things, and for us, in a fur trade, it was a beaver. It had a certain property where you could cut the hair short and it'd make beautiful hats and all kinds of stuff like that. And there was, you know, even our nickel had a beaver in it, right? But to them, that was all about acquisition of goods, And acquisition of goods gives you that money, gives you that power, because money was power, right? And it still is today. When we get funding from the government. Yeah. So we need money to survive today. There's not enough of what used to be to sustain us to live. If somebody left Vancouver to go and live in the bush, he'd still have to buy different things, right?
Yeah.
We don't have that knowledge anymore of how to survive out in we're so used to flicking the switch on. Everything is instant. So we would not be able to survive there. It's almost like a Hollywood dream that we have to get back there. What we all can work toward is the value system that we had when you said, you know, you only take what you need and the rest will continue to grow. And they had that in logging industry. They used to have what they call selective logging, right? You don't cut everything down. You let the young ones grow, because then it'll be continual. Well, when there's a big movement against clear-cut logging, they changed the way they're going to do it. So they called it block cutting. So you take one block here, cut it all down, and go somewhere else, take another block, cut it all down. Eventually, you're going to cut everything down anyway. But it's a different mindset, right? A way of looking at things and changing things in that way. Like that happened, too, to the native people. When the Sundance was outlawed, the big fear for MacDonald was that you get all these Indians together, we'll have an uprising. There was not enough non-Aboriginal people on this side, on the prairies. And they were very afraid because they did not know about the native people. When in our world, if we don't know anything about something, we're afraid. We're afraid of the unknown. That's one of our greatest fears. So they outlawed the Sundance. And so the people wanted their Sundance. And they were not allowed to consult lawyers, but they did. In Piapot Reserve there, I was told, but the chief told me this. He said, the lawyer told us to change the name of their Sundance. So they called it a rain dance. It's the same thing, but they didn't,
Yeah.
It was not against the law.
Wow. You know, that's so interesting because that's I believe that's still a fear today, that a lot of settlers fear that if you get too many Native people together, that there will be an uprising.
Yeah.
Like another one of the things that, sorry for bringing this book up all the time, but I
That's
love
okay.
this book, in Prison of Grass, like Howard Adams cites a specific case of this that's relevant to the Métis, where he says that if you look into the contracts that provide funding for Back to Patoche days, it's funded by the provincial and federal governments on the basis of, there's actually, this is written out, that you cannot, that Back to Patoche is purely cultural and there can be no discussion of politics there. Because it's that fear where it's like, you get too many Métis together and then they start like talking politics, they start talking uprising, then we got a problem on our hands.
Yeah.
And that's pretty recent, right? Like that's still a fear that you get too many people together. And that's, but I kind of like that there's that fear that we might, have an uprising. Because, I don't know, there's a lot of scenarios that do call for uprising. And I think having that, like to bring it back again to that sort of like full-brained thinking that you were talking about, like, I think that that's really essential because like even with the way that our culture is so tied to the land, like we'll lose our culture if land just keeps getting taken away and destroyed, right? So we have to be able to be willing to stand up and practice our culture proudly, but also figure out how to defend our ability to do so, right? How to like stop all of the bad things that are still happening as a result of colonization so that we can still have that freedom and ability to practice that culture, Like, so it's good that there's still a little bit of fear and like too many Métis people getting together.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so I think just on that line of thinking and bringing it back to how we need to move back towards the way that our communities function with only taking what we need and everyone getting what they need, right? So is that we're not living in an exploitative way with the world around us, right? I'm wondering what you think about, like, because nowadays we see through colonization and the introduction of capitalism that the vast majority of society in North America like doesn't live on a basis of only taking what you need and taking care of people around you. It's take as much as you can get and build up as much of that as possible. And so we have these like huge disparities where we have these ultra rich people who hoard wealth and resources, and then we have these people who are living in poverty and don't even have the bare necessities. And a lot of those people are Métis and Indigenous people. So do you think that we can ever achieve reconciliation without, like, within the current system? Or do you think that we might need to switch back to something where we can actually ensure that everyone is getting what they need and things are divided up more equally amongst us?
As long as the mindset that is here now continues, there will never be any equality or in those people who are homeless, who don't have jobs, who don't have money, they will continue to be there because of the mindset that we have, because you've seen yourself that somebody will be laying on the sidewalks and people will walk right over them, step over them. They won't pay attention because we don't value life like we used to a long time ago. We don't give gratitude. And at most times we don't. We try to get into that bus. There's lineups in a bus, and we try to get in front of the bus so that we can get in. So it's a me attitude that we have, and that's colonialism is about that. Imperialism is about that. Capitalism is about that, and that's what's ruling the world now is capitalism. And how do we change a mindset? There is this story that said that the women were in charge before. They were the medicine people. And the Renaissance period in Europe, they got rid of these, what they call witches, right? They stick your hand in tar, and if you don't burn, you're a witch. But if you burn, you're also a witch, right? So there's no way you're going to win. And so trial by ordeal is how they dealt with it, because they wanted to eradicate and get it out of there. So they had this females that were in charge. They raised the children in the way that they saw fit. And the male's role was to support the woman to bring the child up in a good way, so they wouldn't need for anything. That had to change because the male wanted dominion, right? They wanted dominance. So they created what they call a model that would portray 1260 timing frequency. And that's what we live in today. And we're slaves to it. And it perpetuates self-destruction. And it's like a snake eating its tail. So that 12 is based on a 12 months to a year, 60 minutes to an hour, 60 seconds to a minute. We're all slaves to that.
Yeah.
We're always checking our watch, right?
Yeah.
That's what we live by. So how do you get away from something like that? That's all over the world, that time. It was this clock that we're so reliant on was a toy that was made in China. It was made as a toy. It came west. The Babylonians got a hold of it. And they thought, what? This is utility. We can use this. See how much work we can get out of a person in one day, right? So that's where it started to grab. Then, of course, it came west. Will it ever change? Well, our whole system is based on that. Government, no matter what government you have, they're all based on that. They promote changes, but we live in this box. And that's where we're all at. Controlled by that clock. Conservatives are on one end, liberals on this side, NDP might be over here, the Greens might be over here.
Yeah.
But we're still all in the same box, no matter who gets in. There's no change.
Yeah.
We're still the same thing. We have to step out of that box, which means going somewhere we have never been before, as Star Trek would say. But that's why the women are the ones that will change that. Because it's about the cycle, circle. It's not about the box anymore. We have to step out of that box, go into that circle, because everything, the whole universe is on a cycle. Planets revolve around the Earth. Galaxies revolve around each other. At the fundamental level inside of ourselves, we have what we call a DNA double helix. It's a cycle. Everything. Our teepees were in a cycle, circle. There's another teepee coming from the stars joining there. That's our DNA. And the women are more connected to it than the men are. So that model that they have is a circle. We come into this world through a circle of life. And the women are connected to the moon. Most women you ask today in society, how many times a year do you menstruate? They'll say 12. It's not, it's 13. 13 lunations to 1 year, right? And that's the moon time. So they'll go back to that. You see, anywhere you go in the high rise, there's no 13th floor. It's bad luck. But for us, it's life. So that's a thinking, right? How do you change that thinking? Because everything about that, the other timing frequency is 1320, based on the 13.
Yeah.
And it's connected to the stars, the moon, everything. Connected to the galaxies, that 1320 timing frequency. And that 20 is a decimal system. Instead of decimal 10, you got decimal 20. And it's best remembered, the Mayans use that. Their calendars are based on that. 10 fingers and 10 toes is the 20, the decimal system. And we've got 13 big joints in our body. So 1320 we carry. But we've never been taught that. But we, as Métis people and Cree people, Ojibwe, we live that through our ceremonies, the way that we connect to the universe, the mindset that we have, the worldview. That's the one we need. This worldview here is destructive. The male dominant one, the female dominant one. But then it will come together, that whole brain thinking. There's a lady in Alberta that swings people. You know, those swings we used to have back home. We'd put a blanket in between the two strings and we'd put the baby there. And we put a stick above their head to keep the blanket or the strings apart. But that stick that's up there is our older brother and sister, because the trees were the first children of Mother Earth. So that's our older brother and sister watching us. And then the women would swing them and they'd sing to them. And science now says that because that's a left brain and a right brain coming together. You're in whole brain thinking, you're safe, you're powerful. So that's what we need to go to. This woman swings adults because we have what we call trauma. And to go back and try to relive that trauma, to get over it, it's going to re-traumatize you. So this thing, the swing, brings the two brains together, and your whole brain thinking you're most powerful. You'll be able to deal with it like nothing. That's part of... I was in a ceremony in northern Manitoba when the spirits came in there and they said, your women are going to save you. And he said, up north here in the tundra, in a rock, there's an eagle with its wings spread out. Nothing grows on it, just rock. He said, there's something there for the women. When the women are ready, they will go get that thing, and that's when change is going to start. So that's the beyond, right? That's that worldview that we have as Michif, and our language is part of that. So that's us being a part of who we are again, once again, in that way. And it's a mindset. It's the way we see things, the way we feel things through that 13-tone timing frequency. The 1260 we're going to have to let go of. And that's the capitalism and all of that.
Well, I think as we kind of move towards wrapping up here today, I think that might be a good segue to talk a little bit about, you were telling me earlier that you wanted to share some of the stories of your grandmother, and I think now might be a great time to do that.
Okay, my grandmother was born in 1867, and when I knew her, she was already, pretty old, close to 100. But she used to tell us stories about Wisakita, creation stories, and she was Métis. She had that creation story, Cree creation story, right? She had that, and she tell us that, and that's why I remember, because I used to listen to her tell that over and over again. And she knew the names of all the birds. She knew the names of the insects. It was just amazing, the knowledge that she had, because she lived so close to the land. And even in those years, she lived by herself. She still trapped. She still fished. She had a little 12-foot canoe that she used. And she was also a midwife. And they'd call her from different communities to go and give birth. And on her way there, the plants would call her, take me, I'm the one you need. So she'd take them. And that's exactly what she needed to go and do that. That's what we call connection. She had that. My mom didn't have that. My father didn't have that. They had some of it, but not to the extent that my grandmother had. And so that's what where disconnection is we moved away from that. We've moved away from all the knowledge systems. Myself, I have what we call the Sundance. That's part of what my grandmother, all those things that happened, but that's another story. But I didn't listen as much as I should have when I was a kid to my grandmother, but I see it now, and I'd like to learn it, and I can. I have a woman that's a medicine woman in Alberta, and she can tap into that bank where all the stories are that are still here. They're not gone. Just because we don't know them means they're not gone. They're still out here. The air is still here. We breathe the same air Napoleon Bonaparte breathed, right? So what about the stories? Do they just disappear? No, they're still out there.
Yeah.
And we can get them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that really brings it full circle, because I think to push back against the capitalism that is just kind of like seeped into Turtle Island with colonialism, I think it's going to, any sort of fighting back against that is going to need to come from the bottom up, because capitalism is top down, right? And because of the way it was integrated here, it was done so that in a way that situated Indigenous people at the bottom of that hierarchy. And I think this really kind of brings our conversation full circle, because if we're ever going to push back, it's going to need to be us Indigenous people who are the ones leading that. And even like in more detail than that, it will need to be the rematernalization of our communities and have our women leading that, right? Because that was one of the ways that our strength was taken away, was turning our communities from being matriarchal to patriarchal. Because like you've said, like the women just have a different connection to the world around them. Like they are our leaders in these scenarios especially. And so I think that's what we need, and all your stories are really kind of like alluding to that we need an Indigenous women-led revolutionary action if we're actually going to right our world again.
Yeah, and it starts with you. It starts with one individual, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then another one.
Mm-hmm.
Then it works, because it's a inside-out approach,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as opposed to top-down, as you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Coming from our communities. Well, I think we can wrap up our conversation there. Did you have any final thoughts?
Well, I think we're on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
I never would have pictured myself coming to UBC talking about these stories about my grandmother and the perspective that we have as our mother, the earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's our mother. That's where we're going to start. Start from ourselves and our connection to our mother, the earth. And other people will look in on us, and they'll say, "Huh, what's that? What are you talking about?" It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I heard my grandmother say that one time, That's, the excitement is going to grow.
Yeah.
But you have to be that. And which is what you're doing here. You're bringing people together and putting the stories out in this fashion, using modern day tools.
Mm-hmm.
So that's amazing. You're kind of putting Métis in this whole idea.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for everything.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Elder Tom. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. This has been the Sickle and Sash podcast. Marcy, thanks for watching, everyone.
That means we'll see each other again.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.